Thanks, Leonie. Thanks so much for coming, everybody, today. It's really wonderful to see everybody, and it is really, really wonderful to finally be able to get to see people in person and have this one-to-one interaction. It's just not the same if I'm looking at people through a little window like that, or someone freezes up or is on mute. It's great to finally be off mute again. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming today. As Leonie said, we want to make this informal. We want to make it two-way and interactive. We'll have a few little presentations, but we want to leave plenty of time for questions about anything that you might have. We might not have the answers to everything, of course, and we'll tell you if that's the case. But my job to kick off is to tell you a little bit about who we are, what we do, why these below-the-belt cancers are important, and why clinical research and clinical trials are important. Because we're here to try to improve outcomes for people affected by these cancers, and the best way of doing that is through generating evidence so that you can all make good decisions about what to do when and if you're faced with this situation. And you're all here for some reason. You're here because you've already been impacted by one of these cancers, or very likely you know somebody who has been, or you're just interested in this topic. For whatever reason, we hope that we can help meet your needs today. We like to talk about these below-the-belt cancers. It's a nice little shorthand. All the cancers we're talking about are technically below the belt if you wear your belt quite high, because the kidneys are fairly high in the abdomen. But we're talking about cancers of the genitourinary tract. So prostate cancer, which is now the commonest cancer diagnosed in Australia, regardless of whether you're male or female, although it only happens in men. Kidney cancer, bladder cancer, cancer of the testis, and also a cancer of the penis, which is something not a lot of people like to talk about, and that's part of the problem. These cancers are sometimes things that are uncomfortable to talk about, and we want to try to get around that. You probably can't see that figure very clearly, but this is looking at what's happened to survival for cancers of a whole lot of different types across Australia, from a 4 or 5 year gap in the late 80s, early 90s, up until more recently. And the ones with little red boxes around them are these below-the-belt cancers. And you can see for pretty much every cancer there has been an improvement. So we are making strides forward in outcomes for cancer overall, just with diagnosing it better and treating it more effectively, but not for everything. In fact, look at bladder cancer, that's going backwards. For whatever reason, people are not living as long now as they were several years ago. And what's the reason for that? We actually need to try to understand that. Is there something weird that's happened to bladder cancer in the community in general? Are we just not treating people as well? We've got a different population mix, and therefore the way the cancer's showing up is different. Are people just not aware of it? We need to understand that and do better. We certainly can't put up with that. So how do we address that? We can guess, we can try to think what might be the good idea, and the problem with that is sometimes the simple and easy options are, and the obvious ones are not necessarily the correct ones. Or we can actually do something about it, and that's what I want to talk to you about today, what we're doing about it to try to understand this and to try to make improvements. Now, one word you're probably not going to hear from me today, except for just now, is the B word, the breakthrough word. If you read the paper or you watch, God help you, a current affair or something like that, you will think that cancer is being cured several times a day. There's a new breakthrough. It's usually somebody who's been able to cure cancer in a mouse, and I've done that. It's actually pretty easy to cure cancer in a mouse. You can give them all sorts of treatment and they never ever complain. In fact, they don't even vomit. So you can give them chemotherapy and they won't even get the same sort of side effects as humans. Humans are not big bald mice, and that's part of the problem. The reality is that real breakthroughs, real jumps ahead in the field are pretty rare. That's not the way that medical science advances. That maybe happened 4 or 5 times in the whole 20th century, when a whole new class of drugs or something came through. More often it's the small steps forward, and that's the way we make differences. So this is a paper published now quite a few years ago in 2003, 20 years ago now, nearly, so showing what happened to these sort of so-called papers that were meant to really transform things. And about 40% of them, further research showed, no, that actually wasn't true, didn't change things. and 10% of them were turned over altogether. So more than half of them just didn't come to anything, even though they were hyped. Some of them still had potential, and maybe a quarter of them went through, and yes, they actually were something that was going to move the field ahead. So the message from this slide for you is be careful what you hear. Don't believe everything you hear. That includes what you hear from me. Question things. Make sure you understand it, and make sure you understand what the source of your information is when you're hearing about these things, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. What we have to do is understand the disease. Obviously, we need to know what we're dealing with, but we also have to understand the treatment and the person, because this person with this sort of cancer is not the same as that person with the same sort of cancer, because they're different people and they've got different needs and different ways of responding to treatment, and of course the cancer's never quite the same either. And the context that they're dealing with it in as well is important. If we're looking at a new treatment for cancer, we've got to understand, does it work? When should we use it? How does it stack up against what we were doing before? Is something new automatically better? It's actually not necessarily. We've got to show that. And if it is something that looks like a step forward, what's it going to cost the community? What's it going to cost you? And that's not just financial cost. It might be convenience or side effects or something like that. And of course, we need to discover new and better ways of doing things as well. And when you think about research, that might be what you think about. You know, people in the lab and those mice that we're curing cancer in. But basically, what I'm really trying to say is it's important, but it doesn't help anybody until we show that it helps somebody. And that's what clinical trials are about. So what is ANZUP? ANZUP is the Australian and New Zealand Urogenital and Prostate Cancer Trials Group. And our name is ANZUP because you need an acronym you can pronounce. And we were told early on that we needed to have prostate specifically mentioned in there for political reasons if we were going to get anywhere. But it's turned out to be a good acronym. And ANZUP if you support moving the field forward in genitourinary cancer. We've got about 2,000 members across Australia and New Zealand and internationally, and that comprises a mix of clinicians and researchers and scientists and community members from every spectrum. And we are here for one reason. We want to improve outcomes for people affected by these cancers, and we think that the best way of doing that is to generate the evidence that we need to be able to discuss with you when you come to see me or someone else in the clinic, so that you can make the sorts of decisions that are best for you, which might not necessarily be the same decision as someone else makes. It's got to be what's best for you. And we do this by clinical trials, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about those. We're a not-for-profit charity, and we're supported by grant funding and fundraising. We are about engaging with stakeholders. We know that there are great people out there. Prostate Cancer Foundation, Movember, Cancer Councils. These are all important organisations. We're not here to step on their toes, and we're not here to take the money that you'd be donating to them. We're here to work with them and make sure that we're all actually striving toward the same thing. Leonie's already mentioned the Consumer Advisory Panel, which you'll hear more about later on. This is absolutely critical to us. We need to be hearing from you, from the community, about what's important. I'm a doctor, I'm a medical oncologist, I'm a scientist. I might have my own ideas about what's important, but I'm not, as far as I know, currently suffering from any of those cancers. Perhaps I am and I don't know it, but as far as I know, I'm not. So I don't have the perspective that you have. We need to be able to hear from you, to know what the important questions are and what the important needs are to be dealt with. And then also the community is our conduit back to broader people to make sure that this message is getting out there. Now, this is our organisational chart. Now, I won't go through that except to say that we've got a broad representation across all the various disciplines involved in these sorts of cancers and their care and research. And we look at all of those various different cancer types. But we also look at other things beyond the disease. We look in general terms at important aspects of quality of life and supportive care. And we try wherever we can to add value to the process by trying to do that basic science part of it I was talking about before as well. So that's a little bit about who we are, and I just want to take the last few minutes to tell you how we take an idea through to a trial, because if you've not been part of this process, you might not quite understand what's involved, and you probably almost certainly don't understand why it takes so bloody long to get any progress in any of this, and hopefully try to explain this to you. So there's actually two broad ways a clinical trial can be done. You probably think these are mostly done by pharmaceutical companies or something similar, and that's true. That's a huge part of the sector. But there's another type of clinical trial that's done where it's what we call investigator-initiated research. That's where someone like me or someone like Professor Dillon in the audience there or somebody else has got an idea about how we can improve outcomes, and we want to take that forward. And sometimes that's a question that the pharmaceutical company cannot do or won't do because it means working with their competitor or might actually be using less of their drug or something like that. But we've actually all got the same goals. We want to improve outcomes. A pharmaceutical company wants to get their product out there and being sold. Of course they do. They want shareholder returns. They would love to cure cancer, and just frankly, if a company came along and cured cancer, I would be delighted. And if those people got stinking rich as a result of that, I don't think any of us would begrudge that. Cancer would be gone. That would be marvellous. I'd be very grateful for that. The individuals, though, those of us who are not part of pharmaceutical companies, we look after the patients. We look after their families. We also want to cure cancer. We understand the clinical needs, and we base our research questions based on those and on the science. And we would also love to cure cancer. So I'll go through this next bit very quickly. This is just an idea about how the ideas develop. So someone comes along with an idea, which just might be literally something that's come to them while they're sitting on the toilet and think, maybe there's a better way of doing something. And that gets fleshed out into a slightly longer concept, and then we come and talk about it at one of our committees and say, yes, this is actually something that we're going to go ahead and develop. Then we get the brains trust coming in and people from different perspectives coming in and say, okay, here's an effective way of doing this, here's what the research question should be, here's how we can most effectively address that. As part of that, we've got to think about the feasibility, about the costs, about how many clinical sites, hospitals and others might be doing it, what's going to be the logistics behind all of this. This is all hard stuff and it's quite expensive. There's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of approvals that need to be put in place because we've actually got to protect the community. We can't just go out there and experiment on people. We're not even allowed to do that on the mice. Sometimes you think the mice are better looked after than the humans. That's actually not true. Humans are well looked after. And it's not until you get round about to 8 o'clock on this clock that we actually do the trial, but that's not the end of it either, because once you've finished putting people on a clinical trial, you've then got to follow them along and find out what the results of this treatment was. Is it making people live longer? Is it making the cancer shrink? Is it making them feel better? Is it more cost effective? Is it easier to give? Whatever the outcomes are, then we've got to take that information and apply it to practice, otherwise it's just a published paper and doesn't do anything. And that in turn will generate more ideas, and so the cycle goes on. So the way we address that, we try to add value at each of these steps by thinking about the research, other research questions in the lab, supportive care and quality of life issues, health economic questions. We try and do that as we go along as well. Our consumer advisory panel has got input at pretty much all of these aspects, and we have people from the panel involved in generating the ideas and developing them, but also in the trial conduct and interpretation, and they do an absolutely fantastic job of that. And we work with other groups as well to do the logistics to get us to where we need to do to succeed in these trials. Excuse me. So why does it take so long? Well, we have to prove that the treatment is safe, because we don't want to be doing things to put you at harm. Has to work. Has to be cost effective, because if it's out of the reach of the community to manage financially, then it's never going to be used. And there's a process for developing these trials through different stages of research that I won't go into just now, but happy to answer those questions. We have to make sure, though, for these new treatments that we're using them in the right way in the right people. If you use them in the wrong way, they're not going to work. If you use them in people who are not going to benefit, that's not going to help anybody either. So we've got to match that up. Along the way, it becomes necessary for us to talk with the companies, because I'm an oncologist, so I use medications quite a bit, but the same thing applies to surgeons and radiation oncologists and others. They make the products and agents that we use to treat these cancers, so we have to work with them. And they're not evil. They are there, as I said, to try to cure cancer. So we've got to work out how to do that, but also to do it at arm's length, recognising that our drivers are not always necessarily the same. There's a range of regulatory issues that we have to get through, ethics committees, the TGA and others. And then finally, if we're going to implement these treatments into treatment, we need to think about how the community is going to be able to afford to pay it. And things like getting new treatments on the PBS. The evidence that we generate provides the rationale, for example, for a company to go to the federal government and say this is something that the government should be paying for in Australia. So where does the money go? Most of it is actually spent at the clinical sites where the research is done. That's usually in hospitals or other health services. Salaries for the research nurses and the people who look after the data and run the studies there, paying for the various tests and scans and things that need to be done. A lot of it goes into trial management, because if we don't collect this information carefully and make sure that it's completely pristine and robust, then it's suspect and not very useful to people. And we, ANZUP, the group, also incur some costs because we coordinate all this process. We often sponsor these trials and take on those sorts of responsibilities, and we bring these minds together to conceive and run these ideas. So are we getting anywhere? Well, when we started, this is what we thought. This seemed like a pretty good idea at the time, but I don't think any of us had an idea of just quite how ambitious it was. This group started in 2008. In 2020, we won these 3 awards. These come from the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance for Trial of the Year, as well as Excellence in Statistics and Excellence in Consumer Involvement. And we won 3 awards for the same clinical trial that ANZUP led. This was an international clinical trial that's led to changes in treatment of advanced prostate cancer right around the world. This treatment right now is approved in Australia but not yet reimbursed. So our next task is going to be to try to help move that next step along. So we have come a long way from those 2 optimistic spiders there, and it's very gratifying to see that we are actually starting to make some progress. So we are making progress, but it takes small steps. It takes a long time. It does take a lot of money. It's expensive. Most of us donate our time to this. Beware that breakthrough story there. I've used that word twice now. But when you see that, you can almost always ignore everything that comes after it. I'm sorry to say, because it's just not the way medical research usually works. It's very rare. We wish that were not true, but that's the case. And you can help, and I'll talk a bit more about this at the end of the session. What we would like you to take away out of this is that you understand why these cancers are important, and that you understand why clinical research is important. We want to kill off this guinea pig mentality that, they're experimenting on me, this is a bad thing. And what I would like to see, my dream, is that if you're going to see a doctor like me or someone else and we're making a recommendation to you about treatment, that everybody would feel able and willing and keen to ask the question, is there a trial that might be suitable for me? Because being on a clinical trial is simply having access to the very best type of healthcare you can get. And that reads, achievement. You can do anything you set your mind to when you have vision, determination, and an endless supply of expendable labour. Which we don't quite have, but we're getting there. Thank you for that. So I'll hand back to Leonie.